So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you to this thematic track of the 2019 World Sustainable Development Solutions Summit, TERI's flagship conference. My name is Thomas Spencer. I'll just be emceeing today. I'm a fellow at TERI, and I have been managing this Energy Transitions Commission project for the last year. So we are here to present you the interim results from 1 year of work. It's a 2-year project, so quite a substantial undertaking, but we are producing some results at this point in time. So the project grew out of the realization that India's progress on renewables had really dropped the cost of renewable technologies quite dramatically, but we needed to look at the issue of the longer-term grid integration of renewables to be sure that we could have a growing share of renewables in power generation over time. So we will be releasing on the 13th of February 3 reports which are the outputs of 3 of the work packages that have concluded their work. I won't let you see them, but I will show them to you. So it is an incentive to come along to the launch on the 13th. So we'll be launching these 3 reports at the plenary session with Dr. Ajay Mathur and other distinguished colleagues on the 13th of February. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce each speaker as they come up. So I will not introduce the entire panel now, but I'm really excited that we have on the panel both contributions from our partners in the project Climate Policy Initiative, as well as the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, of the United States, as well as insights from corporate stakeholders with whom we've been engaging very closely in this project, sharing insights, data, testing calculations, and that collaboration has been really very fruitful. So I'm very grateful that we have representation from WSDS Rajdhani, the Discom in Delhi, as well as NTPC. So let me introduce our first speaker, who will give you an overview of the project and insight into some of our initial results. He's Mr. A.K. Saxena. He's Director of the Electricity and Fuels Division at TERI and Principal Investigator for this project. He has a very long and distinguished career in the power sector on the government side at the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, at Ministry of Power, and I know that all of us young researchers implementing this project have very much benefited from his guidance and insights. So let me invite Mr. A.K. Saxena to the podium to give his presentation.
Thank you, Thomas. A very warm good morning to all of you and a very warm welcome to all of you. As Thomas briefly introduced the project, this project we have undertaken in the year 2018 with our partners, the Climate Policy Initiative and the NREL. Both the partners are here and we are very happy to present the results which are there from the work so far. This is a continuing project. It continues to the next year, and there will be number of issues, number of challenges, number of aspects to be covered in the years thereafter as well. Now, let me come to the first issue. Now, here in this project, we are looking at the demand and supply integrated analysis, and then what picture does it present to us, so that ultimately we try to draw some insights in regard to the policy and regulatory recommendations which are required to be there. Now, demand in India, demand for electricity has been growing and it will continue to grow on account of a number of drivers such as the industrialization, urbanization, rising incomes, etc. But what will be the demand trajectory is the most important question, because there are a number of uncertainties in regard to the medium-term and long-term demand projection, more so in a developing country like India. Now, the uncertainties are in regard to the composition and structure of the economy, the degree of energy efficiency which could be there, and the end-use uncertainty. When we are trying to project demand for a horizon which is about 12 or 13 years ahead, I think there are a number of uncertainties which could be there, and the number of factors could influence the demand projections. So this is an exercise we hope to continue and refine over the years, but then I am going to present the results which are there from the analysis which has been done so far. I think that is available to you. It's fine. Now, if you look at the macroeconomic scenario, we have built up three scenarios in regard to the demand with the GDP growth rate of 6.8%, 7% and 7.5%, and they give you different projections for electricity demand. And each of this variant has two variants. Each of the scenario has two variants, one regard to the baseline energy efficiency and one with the high energy efficiency scenario. And if you look at the bar chart at the middle, then if you see that the 7.5% GDP growth rate and high efficiency scenario has a demand projection of about 2254. But if we look at the energy efficiency, if it is business as usual scenario, which is if it continues from the past trend, then over about 200 to 300 terawatt hour of demand is going to be added to that. So this is what is a type of certainty which we are doing, that it is there, and which will be seeing more realistically as we move forward. But we will continue to refine our research in this regard as we move forward. Similarly, if you talk about a major end use consumption category in regard to the EVs, I think there is a lot of uncertainty in regard to the uptake of new EVs which would be there in the 2030. We have built different scenarios with the business as usual scenario or the lower penetration of EVs, assuming on an average about 15 to 20% of the new vehicles being there in the year 2030 as the electric vehicles. This gives us a electricity demand of about 77 terawatt hour. But if we take the this uptake of the new vehicles of the order of about 40 to 45%, this goes very markedly up to about, I think, 220 some terawatt hour. So these are the type of uncertainties which are there. So the demand projection in a developing country like India is laced with uncertainties, and that we have to keep note of. That is why in view of this, we have adopted a scenario-based approach, and in which we have adopted three methodologies. One is the econometric modeling, the partial end-use method, and drawing the impressions from the other countries, similarly placed countries who have traversed this developmental path, and how do the projections come in their regard. And all these three demand scenarios have been synthesized into final recommendations, and that is what are the numbers which we are going to be releasing in the report on the 13th of February. Now, if we take the one of the demand scenario, which is a business as usual scenario, which projects the demand or the final consumption to about 2040 terawatt hour. This is the total demand is expected to be growing at about CAGR of about 6%, with the commercial and residential sector growing at about 7%, and the air conditioning and the electric vehicles taking much larger share of growth. Electric vehicles taking a much larger share because the base itself right now is very low. Now, when we come to if this is the scenario in regard to demand, then from this demand side projections, we have come to the supply side analysis. And what would be the supply mix which would be required to meet the demand scenarios is the next question which arises. And if we look at different scenarios, then various combinations of renewable and the fossil fuel based capacity would be there. We have considered three scenarios on the supply side scenarios. One is a current policy scenario, which is the scenario which is as outlined by the government, about 175 gigawatt of renewable by 2022, 275 gigawatt by 2027, and we have taken similar projections up to year 2030 for the current policy scenario. The other scenario is a current trajectory scenario, which takes into account the realistic progress or development in regard to the renewables as of now, which is of the order of 74 gigawatt out of a target of 175 gigawatt. And the third scenario is high renewable scenario. In all these scenarios, you can see that there is a different mix of the coal-based generation, which is in gray color at the bottom of the chart, and the solar and the wind being on the yellow color, and the hashed portion, which is at the top. So these are the type of mixes which can perhaps be there when we reach the year 2030. Now, when we come to the other most important factor which is going to influence the uptake of the various types of generation resources or the supply mix will be the cost of the supply from these renewable sources. Now, we all of us know that the renewables the prices have been coming down very significantly. And if we try to look at the comparative picture in regard to the levelized cost of electricity from the non-pitot stations and the onshore wind and the ground-mounted solar as shown in this bar chart, you will see that the renewables are much cheaper as compared to the non-fossil fossil phase based non-pit head coal. But even if we look at the pit head, that also is these are pretty much comfortable as compared to them. But I think it is fair to compare these renewables with the non-pit head stations. Now, the next most important challenge or what we find in this study is that it is not the demand only, but the demand profile which is going to make the most important impact onto the type of resources we require. A typical profile of from 1st of July to 7th of July of 2030 in a high renewable energy scenario has been projected by our team, and you can see the yellow being the solar generation peaking at the about noon or midday, and then the remainder of the supply which has to come from other resources is shown in the gray color. If you look at the leftmost corner, almost about 220 gigawatt of generation is required from the plants other than solar. But then if you look at the daytime, it comes to about 120 or 130 gigawatt. So about 100 gigawatt of difference is there between the peak time when the solar is there and when the solar is not there. That type of flexibility requirement is going to be a challenge. Whether this much can be integrated into the grid is another question and a challenge which has to be addressed. Now, just talking briefly about the project, what we have, we are trying to do the demand analysis I told about you and an integrated supply side scenario, and then we have investigated their implications. This is the work is complete, and the flexibility needs which are required to be there to meet these supply scenarios is partially complete. Interim results are going to be presented by my colleague, Mr. David Nelson, and then he will give you further update in regard to that. And the cost options and the investment options which are there, they are also being analyzed. Our colleague from the NREL will also give the update in regard to the work they have completed in regard to the hourly dispatch production cost optimization model up to 2030, which they have studied under the project. And finally, we all to analyze the air pollution, but other socio-economic benefits which will be there on account of these renewable projects. And this all will lead to the policy and regulatory recommendations which will ultimately take forward to the central level, to the right agencies, and then ultimately to the state level. And that is what is the overall impression in regard to the project I wanted to give. My colleagues will give further update in regard to the other packages. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let me now invite Mr. David Nelson to give his presentation. David is Executive Director of CPI Energy Finance. And in this project, CPI has been leading the work analyzing the need for flexibility to integrate variable renewables into the Indian power system, characterizing and quantifying those needs, and then looking at the different options to meet those needs by 2030, be it in terms of the cycling of the thermal power fleet, be it in terms of battery storage, pumped hydro storage, or measures on the demand side to make the demand side more flexible. And David, on a personal note, I wanted to say that we have really learned so much from interacting with the CPI team. I think your work has really brought forward the state of the discussion in India. So we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Thomas. And it has been a pleasure for us as well to work with the Terry team and to continue working in India. The question that Mr. Saxena put out was, can we integrate the higher levels of renewable energy? And I'll put an addendum. The question is, at what cost? And that's one of the first things that often comes to the fore is, yes, renewable energy itself is cheaper, but maybe the integration of it will make up for that difference. And I'm going to try to alleviate some of those concerns in this presentation. The key message is that by increasing the flexibility of electricity, it's going to reduce the cost of the system regardless of whether we put in higher levels of renewable energy. That the system flexibility needs with or without renewable energy, but particularly with growing renewable energy, are growing. But there's a lot of options that we have, and it's about incorporating these different options. And finally, we will need to be thinking about fundamental changes to electricity markets and the way we operate our electricity system in India if we're going to integrate these various options for flexibility. So starting with the first thing on I'm going to take my punchline from the very beginning and I've put it to the front. In our modeling, in our analysis, we looked at, and this is at the current trajectory. So if the ambitions for India for renewable energy don't increase beyond where they already have been. In fact, this falls short. These are the TERI scenarios. This falls short of the government targets. What would be the cost of the total average wholesale cost of the electricity system, both with and without additional investment and flexibility? As it turns out, you can see, and one thing I'll mention for Mr. Bhargava's sake in particular, all these wholesale numbers do not include any taxes. That's a policy decision. We're talking about the fundamental cost of electricity to India. And so you would have to add, for instance, the coal taxes to get to what the actual wholesale price would be. So it's important to remember that if you're comparing these numbers to something that might come up with respect to the wholesale prices you currently see. But with all those caveats in mind, the enhanced flexibility will reduce the costs on the current trajectory. But what is interesting is that if you look at the TERI high renewable energy scenario, so beyond what the current policy goals are, once you have enhanced flexibility in case, that's in the third bar from the left, the costs of electricity, of increasing the amount of renewables you have in the system, barely nudge up at all. They nudge up so little that it's in the third decimal place that you see the difference, right? But if you don't do the flexibility, the cost of achieving high renewables becomes much, much higher. The red area on the top is the imputed cost of having diesel to substitute the amount of outages that you would have. Now let me take you through a little bit more how we get to these numbers. First of all, when you're thinking about flexibility, you have to think about the different operational constraints you need to make an electricity system function and function reliably. You have operating reserves, which are the short-term needs in case a power plant or a transmission line goes down, something that's there to respond to emergencies. You have ramping, and ramping is an area where renewable energy in particular has an impact. This is when the sun sets, your production from your solar PV goes down, and everybody comes home at the same time and turns on their lights and their air conditioning, and suddenly you have a very, very rapid increase in the amount of electricity that needs to be provided. This, it turns out, is one of the biggest constraints, perhaps bigger than daily flexibility, that is shifting from day to night, is having enough power plants online that can accelerate fast enough to have the continuous matching between supply and demand at every minute. Then you have the daily balancing, which is moving solar energy to the night or providing, if you need a peak during the day, moving energy production from night to the day. So making sure that you're balanced in every minute across the day. And finally, there's seasonal balancing. That might happen because of monsoons or greater demand when the temperature is hot. What we see in general as on the high renewable energy scenario, by 2025, we're beginning to have some problems, and by 2030, the shortage of these types of flexibility becomes critical. I think it's more interesting if we were to quantify that. We have very simplified metrics here showing a comparison of how much each one of these flexibility needs would grow under the different TERI scenarios. So the first bar is the current trajectory for each one of these groups. The second is the current policy. The third is high renewable energy. But what you can see is that even the reserve requirements are going up 50% faster than either energy requirements and peak demand. And the daily balancing in the high renewable energy scenario goes up 6.3 times. That is 3 times as fast as the overall energy requirement in India. So under a high renewable energy scenario, the need for being able to balance the capacity you need to shift over the course of the day goes up 3 times as fast as energy demand. It's sort of interesting to look, and Mr. Saxena put one of these slides forward, but I always think it's interesting again to take a look about what this means with pictures. These pictures here show the profile in 2017 and 2030 for some of the more difficult, at the top, difficult days for balancing. And you can see on the right, by 2030, you have times where will have excess energy. There'll be more energy from renewables and from your minimum run hydro than you have demand on the system. You'll need to shift that. It's interesting on the bottom to look at what happens in the seasonal basis. And again, you can see that how seasonal this difference is, that by June and July during the monsoon season, August, you have times where you have almost all of your demand across the day met by these renewables. The gray area then is what the flexible generation, what your thermal power plant would need to provide to make the system stable. The other issue is that this flexibility very much differs. There's regional differentiation, which you will need transmission to be able to tie together. The states that have more renewables will need either transmission or to have a more flexible local system. We've taken here Tamil Nadu and Karnataka and looked at how much excess production you would have from your renewable energy. This is how much of your renewable energy would occur in times where renewable energy would exceed the demand. And it gets up to, in Karnataka, by 2030, 20%. That is, in lacking additional flexibility and lacking transmission, you would be spilling 20% of the renewable energy that you provided. Alternatively, you can look at and compare Tamil Nadu and Karnataka against states that will have be more coal dependent and have less renewable energy build out, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar in this case. And you can see what over the course of the year, the change in the load factor, the residual load factor, potentially for the thermal power plants would be on a state-by-state basis. The third one is to look at, and we talked about ramping. If you've got a lot of solar PV, that increases your ramping issues. And you can see here, in this case, Karnataka's ramping needs would be more than double those of India as a whole by 2030, going up to 30% of, in 1 hour, demand would go up to 30% of increase in one peak. And then finally, if you have a lot of wind, it leads to high seasonal shifting. In the case of Tamil Nadu, by 2026, we will see months where you will have effectively no production from anything but renewable energy by 2026 if there were no additional flexibility. The power plants would need to be mothballed or shut down for a couple months at a time. But we have options to fix these things. In addition to transmission that we've talked about, there's also the options of improving the flexibility on the demand side, of storage, and of improving the flexibility of the power plants. And I'm going to take us through each one of those and how those would develop, both in terms of cost perspectives and potential over the next few years. What we do in analyzing this is we've looked at supply curves for various types of flexibility for every single type of flexibility need that we've studied. What this means here, if you look in the blue, those blue areas are what would be the cost for providing a certain amount of flexibility, in this case from a set of demand side measures, including EV charging, air conditioning, agricultural pumping, and thermal storage. You can see in the bottom one where these demand side measures provide a good share of the daily balancing need that we would have by 2030 at a very low cost. Looking at demand flexibility in total, there is a very significant amount between EV charging, agricultural pumping, and space cooling. Industry is also a very, very large potential. We have only looked at a few of the end uses, and in a lot of our analysis, and most of our analysis, we have not yet costed out the industries. And yet, even with that small set of demand side measures we've looked at, we've found that there is very, very significant impact and potential to balance India's electricity system if we get the demand side right. The next issue to look at is batteries. And as we probably have all heard, battery costs have been falling very, very rapidly over the last few years, and the forecasts are for those to fall by perhaps another 75% in India over the next 13 years, driven mostly by electric vehicles. And so in this place, electric vehicles will consume a lot of the battery production, perhaps in India, but it will also drive cost reductions, which will also be very helpful. When you look, however, at batteries, they sometimes don't appear to be the panacea that everyone puts forward, because batteries are, even at these lower costs, quite expensive. If you were to include all of the capital costs of batteries and apply that to providing daily flexibility only, you can see that in this one, they end up being much more expensive. The line need is how much you would actually need to supply it. So the batteries end up being not cost effective in this perspective. However, one of the great things about batteries is they can provide a whole range of services, and they can be placed locally to, for instance, eliminate distribution and transmission constraints, creating their own value. Once you have put the batteries in place for other needs for system stability, and you're using them just on the operating cost, they become highly competitive. And so the key with batteries is being able to balance these various needs, and really is creating markets where you can integrate the various incentives to both locate them effectively and to get the proper price signals in place. Then finally, we have the power plants themselves. The power plants will continue through 2030 to be the major source of flexibility going forward. And here in the light olive are the existing power plants. There are some new power plants from the TERI high renewable energy scenario that are still being built, and they're in the dark olive. You can see the new hydro power plant. But you can see, if you again look at the daily balancing need of 870 gigawatts per hour, that there's a significant utilization of power plants still here to balance the need through 2030. And in particular, the power plants will be needed to provide the seasonal balancing. And you can look down in the 2030 that almost all of the seasonal balancing through 2030 will be provided by power plants and the related transmission. To get to these numbers, you need to think about, well, first, what's the existing capacity, what additions and retirements there will be, what will be the availability, that is what power plants will be online, and then you have to adjust for minimum generation. Your thermal power plants in order to have a power plant available in 3 or 4 hours time, you have to have it operating. They generally need to operate in India to have a minimum generation threshold of 55%. So the amount of flexibility that you have, the amount of ramping capacity, is generally moving from 55 to 100% of capacity. In a number of states, there's regulation that keeps them from going below 70%. So that means only 30% of the capacity is available for flexibility. We have, and I think we'll have some further discussions on this panel about options to increase the flexibility, sometimes just through operational changes, through control systems, but also sometimes through improvements to the plant itself, where you could potentially get the plants down to 40% minimum operating thresholds, which clearly increases your flexibility from 45% of the 100 to 60% of the 100. That is what is defined in that. You'll see there's a red box up there, and those are incorporated in our analysis as slightly more expensive, but still very valuable parts of the potential flexibility picture going forward. Another thing to consider is, how do we incorporate diesel generation? It turns out that diesel generation, if it can be tied to the system, does have a role in helping balance the system for those peak days, those few peak days where you get to the very end. So you wouldn't want to build a new power plant or a battery to operate 2 or 3 days a year, but in some cases building and operating a diesel plant to meet those peak days, it happens at a 2% load factor, that's 2% of the time, can feed and help reduce the costs. So then, to look at the overall costs, what we have done is assessed how portfolios of flexibility work together. And those portfolios depend crucially on 2 elements. The first is how much renewable energy. So we've looked at the three TERI scenarios, the current policy, the current trajectory, the current policy, and the high renewable energy. And then how much demand side flexibility you actually have into place. And what that gives you is, do we have one that's driven by demand side, one that's driven by storage, one that's driven by a portfolio of options, or one that's driven by power plants? And what we've done is we've compared the costs of those different flexibility options to see what they do. Before we get to the comparison of the portfolios, I thought it'd be interesting to put up another one of these slides to show how the two different portfolios operate. On the left-hand side, you will see that if you've incorporated a lot of storage and demand flexibility, a couple of interesting things happen compared to one that's driven just by power plants. First of all, the power plants themselves run much more constant, which improves the efficiency and reduces the emissions from those power plants. The second thing is, on the right-hand chart, you will see a lot of energy that is spilled, a lot of renewable energy that is being wasted. Well, on the left, you will see that almost all of that is recovered and used through your demand shifting or through your storage. And so the question is the investment to achieve those improvements worth it? And so if we look, and on the left is the current trajectory and the right is the high renewable energy, for those four different types of portfolios, one where the flexibility is driven entirely by power plants, including enhancements, one driven by demand, one driven by storage, and one driven by balance. We looked at how does that affect the amount of excess energy, the total cost of the system, and the carbon emissions. And the key is, if you're looking at the green, the squares highlighted in green, those are the ones that have the best performance. If you're looking at the portfolio performance for high renewable energy, the balanced portfolio reduces excess energy or the energy spillage by 82%. It reduces your total cost by about 8%, and it reduces your carbon emissions by 12%. So clearly, if we can develop a balanced portfolio that has your power plants, storage, and demand flexibility all working in tandem, we have a significant value to achieve for the Indian system. And then looking just a little bit further, this is a repeat with a little more detail of the first slide, looking at each one of those scenarios, but a little bit more detail in terms of the thermal and demand flexibility only. The first slide included only the base and the portfolio. Another issue, going back to the States, is understanding everything that I've done so far has been at the India level, understanding how the regional differences affect both your need for transmission and how you should be addressing flexibility to state level. The key is that you have states like Karnataka and Tamil Nadu where they will need additional flexibility. They will need to be importers. A state like Bihar, we have found that they will need the flexibility to reduce their own internal costs. But a state like Uttar Pradesh, with a lot of industrial demand, a lot of coal-fired power plants, will be a potential exporter of flexibility. So there is a potential for a market where we can use the additional flexibility that Uttar Pradesh has, and with the appropriate markets, sell that to states like Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra or Karnataka, with both sides ending up better off. So that is showing where both the transmission and the markets are important to make sure that we can share the benefits of flexibility across India. And then finally, how do we get there? And that's where we're turning to next in the ETC. What are the key steps that we need to take in India to push this forward? First of all, we need to develop data so that we can make informed decisions and that we can have others, investors and developers make informed decisions. We need to have technology developed in some cases, and in particular, it's developing the lower cost storage technology. We need to have infrastructure to tie things together. We need awareness. We need new business models. We need incentives, and we need a market design. And if you're looking through each one of these options, just to give an example of demand flexibility, the first thing is we need to have a better view of how much demand flexibility there is and what will be the potential and cost, building on what we've had here so that we can use that in our planning, but also so that people who want to develop businesses out of this can see, is it worth the investment? We need to develop awareness from consumers and potential aggregators that these opportunities exist. And then we will need investment in creating the companies and the IT and control systems that will make this work. And then you will see across each one of these 5 things that we need to do: the demand flexibility, the storage, the power plants, transmission, and to integrate all of these things together. Each one of these steps has a different potential input and value that needs to feed into reaching the eventual system that can integrate all of these options. And then we need a market design or a series of market designs that will pull this all together, that it makes sure that we're integrating all of these pieces at the lowest cost. That's all I have.
Yes, I think that applause is well deserved. Let me invite Mr. Mohit Bhargava, who has been our companion on this project for some time. Would you like to speak from here or from here? Yeah. So Mr. Bhargava is from NTPC, 12th largest power generation company in the world, largest in India, primarily dominated by coal, but increasingly looking at diversifying its mix and playing a role in the transition of the Indian power sector. So over to you, sir.
Good morning. I hope I'm clear. Yeah. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Mr. Saxena, and thanks, David, for an excellent presentation. I'm really not sure where to begin, because this is a topic which I think is confronting everyone across the world, more so in India. And a lot of good data has already been presented by David there. So some of the points which my team gave me were actually based on what he had presented to us earlier. And Uditanshu is here, so she knows. Anyway, let me skip the part where we discuss about the basic things like flexibility needs. But yes, there are some things which probably we need to take note of. And as Thomas pointed out, we are the largest generating company in India, no doubt. We supply almost a quarter of the power to the country. And flexibility is an issue which confronts us in a major way. And we want to be a proactive participant in the whole process rather than a reactive one. So if you look at the flexibility needs, yes, reserves, ramping, daily balancing, seasonal balancing, I mean, all these things are there. But some of the big numbers, which I'm not sure part of it was here, based on the current RE scenario, which you're saying 275 gigawatts by 2030, I think you said? Yeah. So we are looking at an intraday load change of almost 150 to 200 gigawatts for us for coal-based plants. And by all accounts, today, for example, India has about 350 gigawatts of total installed capacity. We have about 200 gigawatts of coal-based plants. As things stand, by 2030, probably we'll have, I don't know, 600 gigawatts or 650 gigawatts of installed capacity, and coal-based plants will remain at 200, 250. I mean, that's what people want it to happen. Although ministry and possibly NTPC also is of the view that we actually need to increase the coal-based capacity also, because otherwise we are actually facing shortages. So if I go by this logic of about 650 to 700 gigawatts of total capacity and coal-based capacity of say 250 gigawatts, so every day 60% of that capacity has to either shut down or back down and play in the flexible market. Then of course we are talking about another number which I took from your presentation earlier was the ramping requirement. 850 megawatts per minute, that is huge by I think any yardstick. So I really don't know how that's going to happen. And you of course also ruled out that we can't have a low RE scenario. So that's not a given in any case, that's off the table. So we have what we have. And in all this, actually, I wanted to add two more items. One, of course, is the affordability part, because ultimately India is a very price sensitive country. So we have been very happy saying that we have renewables today at 250. And other is what the generators need to do. So when we look at the demand side options, for example, it's very clear that demand side will have a very limited impact. There aren't too many things that are going to happen. If I look at the storage side, you again pointed out that most of the lithium-ion battery is going to, for the EVs, I think. And given the scenario that lithium-ion is only so much, I mean, that's what we hear. There's only so much lithium-ion in the world, so most of it going to the batteries. So where do you have the storage left for the grid? So that leaves the only option, flexing the power plants. And flexing the power plants when we have to do. So obviously the issues are cost considerations. How much do you pay NTPC, for example, to flex? No prizes for guessing. Everyone said, let's not pay them anything. That's the easiest option. But then sometimes you have to run a business. So there's a big debate nowadays about what actually is the cost of flexing. And this is a debate sometimes people try to ascribe to us, which, let me assure you, we are not part of that. But there's a huge debate around the numbers. So in one of the presentations, we saw that the cost of flexibility is only some like 30 paise per unit, which appeared pretty low. Then there was another study which said almost 1.5 rupees per unit, probably closer to what we think. Some very good presentation also said almost 3 rupees per unit. I said, oh, let that happen. So that was our point of view, let's have the highest cost thing. But jokes apart, the fact is that with flexibilization and efficiency improvements, and our friends from Siemens are here, so we have been doing a lot of study on how to actually make plants flex. And we've got some good results, and that will be an essential part of how the things progress. Another thing which we wanted to do, and we are very thankful that the Ministry of Power came out with, was they came out with a policy last year in April, I think. Flexibility in generation and scheduling for reducing emissions. I don't know why they called it reducing emissions. That's, of course, one part of the job. But the more important part was that now the generating companies should themselves become part of the flexibility solutions. And this is where I think when you say power plants, flexibility of the power plants can also happen when I know how much I have to flex every day. So that particular scheme said that if I have a renewable capacity, or either I have access to a renewable capacity, so against my schedule, I be allowed to schedule that during the day. So that what that means is that I know how much I have to schedule, how much I have to back down, and I'm prepared for that. What we understand is that CRC is working on that, so probably that'll take some more time. But that we feel is one area, because everything if we try to force down, and there's some single body which is deciding, then it becomes a very black box kind of situation. So our sense is that once we enter that flexibility regime, we need to have generating companies on board fully, where not only they are compensated, and probably all of you know that compensation is happening. Some of it has already happened on the regulatory side. CRC has given compensation for technical minimum, and I totally agree with David that should happen across the board. Today it's happening only on NTPC, like whatever CRC controls. So we have a technical minimum of 55%, but we are not the only generating company in the country. So every generator has to actually have, and that is where I think CRC is working on that, so they can get all the CRCs on board, so they can all come down to 55. But our sense is that when flexibility actually happens in 2025, I mean, we think it might happen actually earlier. So we might be having, the flexing of the power plants from 30% to 75% or maybe even lower. And so we probably need to have flexing requirements for even lower, not 55%, but 30%. And one of the efforts which we are trying to do with companies like Siemens and others is that we are trying to see how we can bring down the loading pattern of a generating station. So there is a cost. One of the studies we have done says that for a 500 megawatt unit, anything around 20 crores per unit we might require. We want to make it capable to come down to 25 to 30%. So that's not a big number. We are sure it will be agreed to by most of the stakeholders. Then of course there is in terms of increasing the O&M costs, increasing the compensation, the efficiency charges, and so on and so forth. So now the question is how to make it all affordable for the consumer. David very nicely put out that the 4.6 rupees is exclusive of taxes, and that's a good spin to that number. The actual purchase cost for a discom, I don't know, a lot of good people here, could vary from anything from 5 rupees to 8 rupees for reasonable discount, and this could actually increase. There's also another debate on what actually is the integration cost, which I touched upon earlier. So we had one simple question which I posed to CPI also. How do you load the integration cost? It's very easy to say it's only an additional 50 paisa or 1 rupee. For example, if there was no renewable, so what was the cost the distribution company had to pay per unit for any new unit coming to the system, which was 4 rupees, as you rightly says, a coal-based plant. But now because of that, and loading the transmission costs, the losses, the balancing, the reserves, we are saying renewable is only 2 rupees 44. Incidentally, that hasn't happened so far, but we hope it will happen soon. So the true cost of renewable also needs to be reflected. And why I am saying that is for one very simple reason. Today there's a lot of discussion that renewables are very cheap and lower than the marginal cost of generation from power plants. Absolutely correct. But then that is at that bus bar. And incidentally, all of that is being loaded onto the regular. Ultimately, customer is paying everything. It's not as if we are paying, every customer is paying that cost. So is there a time, and this is a discussion which I believe CRC has started, how to do the scheduling for renewables? Right now it's a must run. I believe in a few geographies across the world they have started talking about scheduling and maybe two-part tariff for renewables. I don't know how they'll work out. Hydro is one good example. But the idea is that renewable also, the uncertainty can be brought down if we have a fair idea of how it's going to happen. And that's another important framework which needs to evolve is the forecasting framework. And it's not an easy one because a lot of variables in India, even more, election is another variable, and festivals are another variables which are probably not there. These Americans celebrate only 2 or 3 festivals. We don't do that. We celebrate across the year. So we have those variables coming in, and of course we have all these events like today there is election, tomorrow there is a strike, or sometimes like Kumbh Mela. I am not getting coal to my Dadri stations because the entire railway network is dedicated to move, I don't know, crores of pilgrims to Allahabad. All these are events which actually impact the prices. So these are things. So forecasting is a very important requirement. Today we are, a lot of people and some good consultants have come to us and said we are doing 93% or we are doing 94%, which they say is very good. Probably it is. But I need 99%. If I cannot decide what's going to be my schedule or demand for tomorrow, I can't put a number to it. So every day I might be losing some money by saying, okay, tomorrow I'll do solar so much, but it doesn't happen and I lose the money. So forecasting is an important number. This is other than the price signals, because any flexibility requirement will also require price signals. So if we have these things, and of course the other part is the proactive participation of the generators. So we feel that we'll have a much better framework as it evolves, because this is happening everywhere. Germany is a good example, which we are also trying to learn from, and a lot of people have also explained earlier during earlier meetings that Germany has gone from a situation where probably on certain days in January they actually had almost 5 to 6 hours of 100% power coming from renewables. So I don't know when that's going to happen to us. It may or may not happen because we still have a huge base load requirement. In terms of flexing, I think one of the points which David raised was that, I think there was a slide which said supercritical, pithead and all that. We feel it's slightly different because supercriticals are actually not made for flexing. So whatever new supercriticals have happened over the last few years, they will face the biggest problem in terms of flexing. A subcritical machine, incidentally, is better suited for flexible operation because inherently it can move very easily across the efficiency curve. So we have the subcritical machines at pithead, which the DISCOMs would want to run because they are the cheapest sources of power. We have supercriticals now coming up at load center stations. Some of those are of course stressed, so maybe no one will have to pay the cost for that. But if they are running, so that's a huge cost. So the entire equation will keep on changing in terms of how and what are the stations which will come to the flexibility thing. So that leaves a few questions. I don't have all the answers. I know probably I don't have too many answers. I don't have any answer. I mean, I could say any of those things. But the fact remains, the framework in terms of, one is the cost part, second is the participation part, and third is a forecasting level or how to make it cheaper. So those are three questions. I probably will leave, and I'll be happy to take questions as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let me invite Mr. Abhishek Ranjan, who is Additional Vice President, System Operations and Head, Renewable and Demand-Side Management Initiatives at WSDS Rajdhani Power, one of the retail suppliers here in Delhi. So, Mr. Ranjan had sent me this morning a very nice video that they are using to sensitize consumers to the potential for saving electricity and participating in flexibility. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time to show it, but you do have an excellent presentation as well. So I'll bring that up and invite you to give that.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Terry, for inviting me over here. And first of all, I would like to congratulate Terry for a very good initiative in terms of studies and flexibility needs, and very aptly timed actually. So we are at the juncture wherein we are adding more and more renewables. So we do not want to end up in a very surprising situation. So very briefly, this is how I'll try to put up the things. We are a distribution utility in the city of Delhi, serving west and southern part of it. It's about 43% of the entire Delhi that we are serving. And very briefly, this is how our trajectory had been in serving the load in Delhi. So the last year it was over 7,000 or 7 gigawatt of load was met, out of which around 3,100 was met by BRPL. So, and the CAGR growth has been, as you can see, in 6% of the last 16 years now. We came into being in the year 2002 once the unbundling of the distribution sector happened in the city of Delhi. And so 43% in energy terms, and also similar in terms of the instantaneous peak demand met. So this is how we are contributing to the city of Delhi. Now going forward, as of now, as we stand today, the share of renewables in our portfolio is very low. I mean, so maybe 3% by capacity terms. But given the RPOs that we have, renewable purchase obligations, and also the concern for green portfolio or lowering our carbon footprint. By the way, there is no GHG reduction targets for DISCOMs here in India, unlike US or California, for example, which is a good thing. So we have tied up a couple of PPAs long term under tariff-based bid, and the weighted average cost, if I say, for example, if you see the curve, today we are at 133 megawatt. The breakup is given over here: solar rooftop, ISTS connected at Seki, waste to energy, and wind, which goes up to even up to 934 megawatt, and that is FY 21-22, all PPA signed up. So this, when we achieve on bar, will be around say 19 to 20% of our entire portfolio. Currently 85-86% of portfolio is coal, purely coal, and NTPC is our major supplier. In Delhi we have only gas-based station. The thermal last station, the Badapur, closed down very recently in October last year, and that was the last season it ran for after 40 plus years of operation. So what we are trying to say is there is an opportunity. We are now greening the portfolio. Then there are certain challenges as well. So when we go ahead with this kind of portfolio, what are the challenges? So I have very distinct or typical load curves. If you see the left hand side, that is summer part, and then there is a right hand side, that is winter part right now that we are experiencing. So Delhi peaks twice in summer, as we can see from the two camel humps, one in the afternoon, maybe 3 p.m. or something, and another in the night, maybe around 2300 hours or something. So this is typical for the 6 months in a year, April to September. So the entire period, if you see, and then coupled with this, the solar generation, the wind generation, there is an opportunity to shift the peak demand a little bit in the summer on the left hand side to coincide with the peak generation, the solar part in the day, and also in the evening we can slightly prepone it to match with the higher wind share. Similarly, in the winters, it can be postponed a little bit from 10 a.m. To maybe around 12 noon or something, and there could be an opportunity for ADR, that is automated demand response, and BDR, that is behavioral demand response, in all the consumer category. By the way, we are 85-86% residential consumer by numbers, and by load it is around 70%. So balancing of renewable energy as well as the battery energy sources will be the key along with the DR, and that's what we have seen in countries like Germany. Technology has to play a very key role, important role. So on a brief note, we have now started partnered with Oracle Utilities on the behavioral energy efficiency pilot program, in which around 2 lakh consumers have been covered. October 2018 it's all started with the delivery of home energy reports, both hard and email, as well as it is available on their websites who will have participated. And they have a number of widgets basis which they can optimize their consumption and actually benefit from the program. And there is a behavioral aspect when you compare with the neighbors, etc. So tips are also being given over this. This is a typical spaghetti chart from Oracle, courtesy Oracle Utilities. So here they have tried to figure out and show that how the utilities across the globe, I mean more than 100 utilities including California or Baltimore, they have benefited a lot from this, and they have come to some kind of indication that on an average around 2% of average savings is indicated, but that is a number which is we are going to assess in India as to what it is going to be, and this has been scientifically validated by many consultants across the globe. And the next steps for the policy and research could be like, what are the regulatory approval processes for mainstream such kind of initiatives, because the demand side flexing or demand side management, etc., is not a key thing which is happening in India right now, but that has to happen. How has a regulator to be convinced for those kind of things? Next is how technology, like for example OpenADR platform, which is now standard by IEC, last month it was notified. So how they can be roped in, and so that the demand side and demand side flexibilities, etc., can be made mainstream, and we have practice in all the distribution utilities. So with this, I'll like to end my presentation. Thomas, if you can have just 3-minute video, that is, if you can permit. Thank you.
How can I say no?
Okay.
You have got through your presentation so expeditiously that I cannot refuse.
You know what is this? Well, some document from WSDS.
Can we have some volume, please?
But it's much more than that. It's almost like my savings certificate.
I don't get it. How?
It's a bi-monthly report of a first-of-its-kind project in India, launched by BSES Rajdhani Power Limited, the Home Energy Report Program under the Behavioral Energy Efficiency Initiative. It's a unique drive with a $1 million grant by the US Trade and Development Agency and partnered by Oracle Utilities. And the best part for me, it helps me cut down on my electricity consumption and save on my bill.
That sounds interesting. I want to know more.
Well, it's an 18-month pilot project covering 2 lakh customers in South and West Delhi. BSES Rajdhani Power Limited has launched a proprietary and password-protected portal in which you feed in your home details such as number of rooms, total air conditioners, building type, your neighborhood, etc. The portal has got 5 online widgets to better capture your details, and they are so easy to use. What's more, the portal can be accessed on your mobile phone too. So, you can use it whenever, wherever you want. Then this portal will give you a monthly comparison on how your energy use compares with other similar homes nearby. For an even more detailed analysis, you can sign up for an online survey and get an evaluation customized for your home requirements. This evaluation will tell you on where you can cut down on electricity consumption.
That's very promising. But what is this report about?
It's divided in different parts. Here, let me explain it to you. Over here, it shows your comparison with other homes like yours in nearby areas. It tells you how you compare with them in terms of energy usage and whether you are energy efficient or not. Now, if you look at this section here, it tells you which is the point of the highest electricity consumption in your home. So you can figure out where to focus more on energy conservation. I'm sure you're wondering how you can save on power usage in your home. Well, you are in luck. This part here gives you some really cool energy saving tips. In order to get tips customized specifically for your home, just click on this link on the portal and can fill an online survey. It's that simple. Now, if you have deployed some energy saving measures in your home, you would want to know their results. Hence, this chart over here shows you your electricity consumption over a period of time, so you can get a sense of how you are faring in your energy usage. And for all your queries, the report has a section dedicated to the FAQs.
That's so comprehensive.
Exactly. Enlisted customers can download this report from the portal every month, and these are also mailed to them bi-monthly and printed on 100% recycled paper.
Wow, BSES Rajdhani Power Limited is really committed to saving the environment.
We should be too. If we save energy, we help reduce pollution rising due to electricity generation. I'm so proud to be a part of this program. You know, this initiative might be launched across India soon. It feels so great to be a part of this inspiring change.
I can't wait for BSES Rajdhani Power Limited to cover our entire city under the Home Energy Report program. Save energy, save money, save the environment. So proud of you, BSES Rajdhani Power Limited.
So I think that's a very nice example of how to engage with customers, which we will need to do to expand energy saving and demand side management. So our final speaker is Mr. David Palchak from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the United States. He has been working for several years in India on the simulation of the electricity grid at 15-minute hourly resolutions, so you can really look at how the grid has to operate with a high share of renewables. So he's going to give us a presentation on some of the work that they have done in the past and give you some insights into what they will be doing under this Energy Transitions Commission project. And then after that, I think hopefully we'll have 20 to 25 minutes for question and discussion with the panel.
Thank you, Thomas. Good afternoon, everyone. It's been a very interesting morning and great perspectives from the panel so far. So good job putting that together, Shixin and Thomas. So hopefully I bring a new perspective here a little bit. There will be some overlap, obviously, in talking about renewable energy and flexibility. But what NREL has done for many years in India is brought a lot of high-resolution modeling, worked with a lot of people in India on kind of building that capacity within the institutions here. So I'm going to talk some about that experience, as well as hopefully give some international experience to this as well. So I'll just start with talking about renewables on the grid today around the world, just to give perspective about the sorts of models that we use, and then get into some modeling with high resolution, insights from Greening the Grid, which was a study that NREL did with the Ministry of Power and was published over the last couple of years, and then looking forward to 2030. One of the reasons I'm giving some insights from Greening the Grid is that while NREL is part of the ETC group, based on the timing and some of the outputs from our partners at CPI and Terry, we will be doing some modeling of 2030 in the future. So look forward to that in the coming months. So as been said many times, renewable energy growth is really transforming power systems right now. And I just wanted to give some perspective on some of the recent records, and this is probably outdated at this point. This is from a paper in 2017 where renewable is growing all over the world. In some cases, obviously in Europe, it's been growing a lot, which has been mentioned. And from an energy perspective, it's having a huge impact, especially in places like Denmark and Australia, where you're getting up to 20 to 40% of renewable energy over the year. But what that means for grid operators and people dealing with it on a daily basis, it can be very different. So in Europe, you've seen cases where over 100% of the energy at certain times is coming from renewables. basically wind and solar at this point. And I say asynchronous generation, meaning inverter-based, which is basically wind and solar at this point in time. In the US, there's also a lot of big things happening, getting up into the 30 to 50% instantaneous penetration, even in systems where from an energy perspective, you're still down in the 10 to 20% range. And I just wanted to add a couple recent numbers that I've seen on the US where individual states are hitting over 100%, and where I'm from in Colorado hitting 75% recently. So an operational perspective, this is an achievement in a lot of ways, and something that people said couldn't be done even as recently as a few years ago. And I wanted to give that perspective before showing what we kind of call our flexibility curve here, and showing the relative economics of different flexibility options. And this has been talked about kind of at length from many of our speakers already. But I just wanted to lay out kind of the cost of different interventions and the types of interventions, and the idea that there's a lot of different solutions out there, some of them more cost effective than others. And what we see here are relative cost. Obviously, this changes depending on where you are. But one that probably everybody notices is up in the top right side, where you see chemical storage. The most expensive type of intervention, and this might even be outdated because batteries are coming down a lot in cost right now. But I think it's important to put into perspective, as David said, where batteries are seen as a panacea, but oftentimes there's a lot of lower hanging fruit that can be done from an operations perspective, integrating markets into certain places, demand side, which we've talked about, a number of other things, flexible generation, increasing transmission. So these are other things that should be considered as a whole system of flexibility, and looking at this as a system-wide problem. So now I'm going to jump into some of the high-resolution modeling that really helps us answer some of these questions about what flexibility options are most cost-effective. And when I mean high-resolution, I'm talking about kind of a sliver of the modeling framework, and I'll go into that a little bit in a minute. But I'm talking about temporal resolution, having high temporal resolution. In this case, what I'm going to talk about in some of the results I'm going to show is about grid operation time frame, so daily, hourly, blockwise even, temporal resolution. Spatial resolution is becoming more and more important as renewables are put on the system. So you want to be able to capture the characteristics of different types of generation around the country, where in the past it might have just been important to have network representation. Now it's important to have geography built into all of these models, as wind and solar in different places is different, and I think we all know that one. System resolution is also important, making sure that we capture the impacts of the individual generators that NTPC and all of the other companies are dealing with operating. It's very important to have the interactions of what individual generators can do on the system, and also capturing the power flow around the country. And ultimately, what these models can do, beyond just giving good numbers to everybody, is help give confidence to planners and giving them the tools they need to think about implementing these different flexibility options that we've been talking about. So for one, kind of informing grid planners, operators, regulators about cost impacts and potential reliability impacts of changing your system in a certain way. And making sure the solutions are robust. The other is really about enabling and making sure stakeholders are involved in this process throughout. So when we're modeling the system for the future, we're not just doing this in a black box, but we're having people like NTPC and POSICO and Power Grid in the room telling us, actually this can or can't be done, hopefully stretching their minds a little bit as well, but making sure that everybody's involved in the process. And further, it's really about creating frameworks for modeling in the future and building on those frameworks and making sure stakeholders are involved in modeling practices and data analysis practices that can be used in future analysis. And part of this framework is actually connecting to other sectors, which I'm going to talk about briefly here. And I just wanted to show this to give a perspective on what I'm actually talking about. So What this plot shows is essentially that the electricity system is planned in many stages along the bottom axis there, where you see seconds, minutes, years, and decades. It needs to be planned along all these stages, and the impacts of one need to be taken into account in the other. The top and the bottom, the difference there is really looking at kind of the device distribution level issues up to the transmission interconnection-wide issues, and making sure that models between here are talking to each other and passing data between them. And so that's part of creating that framework. And something else that has been sort of talked about so far is that, you know, this isn't really an electricity system, just an electricity system anymore. This is about energy. And as we get closer to the grid edge with distribution systems changing, it's important to bring in a lot of different sectors in this and make sure that data is getting passed between these models about gas, about water, about the transportation system, as well as a number of other things, the demand side. So now I'm just going to go through a couple of the lessons we learned in greening the grid, and hopefully push that forward to the conversation that we're having about 2030. So this was a study that was supported by USAID and a number of other sponsors in partnership with Ministry of Power, and it was looking at the 2022 target of 160 gigawatts solar and wind. That was the primary purpose, but we did have another scenario, which I'll talk about. But specific to this model, what we put in was really high wind and solar resolution, which the Renewable Energy Lab is probably not a surprise. We take very seriously, making sure that we're running weather models and capturing all the different interactions across the country. A lot of input into the generators. We worked with POSCO closely to make sure we had a lot of details on each generator in the country. And transmission obviously played a part as far as power flows and also looking at reliability. So maybe this will play. And so this just gives a snapshot of the outputs of the model. So right now you see the sun coming up over India, and on the map is just a summary of the different generation that's happening on the system. And you see yellow coming on, that's the solar coming on during the middle of the day, wind in the dark blue, coal in the black, hydro in the light blue, and there's also some nuclear on there. And as the sun goes down, we see the solar coming offline. And so we see the interactions happening around the country. What just happened in the bottom right is we changed our dispatch stacks to be able to look at what's happening at the national level and what's happening at Tamil Nadu. And so this is an important component of these models, is being able to dig into certain interactions at the state level as well. And in the bottom right, it's about to disappear, but there are some red dots happening, and that's what we saw as curtailed energy. So we allowed renewable energy to be curtailed in our models, which was something that was decided by the stakeholders as being an important component of the future, maybe transferring out of the must-run status and allowing renewables to be good grid citizens, flexible just like everything else in certain cases if need be. And so one of the big outcomes of that study is essentially in 2022, you were able to achieve system balance under a certain set of circumstances. And as I just said, so there is a lot of physical flexibility in the system. It's a big system, and that's an advantage, and there's a lot of good transmission. Harnessing this is certainly very difficult from a regulation, markets, and incentives perspectives, and CPI talked about some of those challenges as well, and that's certainly another thing to think about beyond the technical considerations. Another thing we found when looking at individual states is that planning the optimal locations for RE and transmission is going to be critical. And digging into that a little bit, if we just look at Gujarat for one moment, what we saw was 36% annual penetration. And you can see the map of India on the right. You see average renewable penetration as a percent of load in the blue, and green average percent of generation. And we see some of the states are hitting very high numbers. But really what I want to point out is that 36% annual generation doesn't really tell the whole story. Gujarat hit 81% instantaneous peak in our model. So that's something that needs to be considered, and certainly something that could be helpful from a grid operations standpoint and also from a regulation and planning standpoint. So I just wanted to point out a couple of the dispatch stacks that came out of our model. On the left, you see a high load period, and on the right, you see a high RE period that we just plucked from the model. And kind of very different scenarios there, where in the high load period, Gujarat is using imports and exports quite a bit. That dotted line there is the load of Gujarat. And on that day, actually, there was very little renewable energy at the beginning of the day, so it was importing. And then as renewables turned up, it was able to serve more of its load. As we go to a high RE period, it's serving more of its load throughout the whole time. But this is kind of a good signal of the transmission, the importance of transmission, and the importance of cooperating across the states, and how that can be cost effective for states to be doing in the future. So going beyond the target of 2022 is something that our stakeholders also wanted to understand, is what happens beyond this? What happens if the growth of RE was somehow a lot higher, or maybe we're looking just a little bit further into the future? So I just wanted to highlight a few things from another scenario, which looked at 2022 with 250 gigawatts of wind and solar. So what we saw was a 65% instantaneous peak nationwide, and in the 160 gigawatt scenario was 54%. That number would actually be quite a bit more if there wasn't curtailment in that period. And you can see that down in the bottom left when we look at the net load curve. So in the black is the load, in the orange and the red is the net load. And we can see that in our 160 gigawatt scenario, you're getting pretty low in the middle of the day, especially during the monsoon period. In the higher renewable scenario, you're getting quite a bit lower, but that flattens out there at the bottom, and that's because the renewable energy is actually getting curtailed in that period. And so there's not quite enough of a system there to be able to absorb that. And some of that comes from poorly planned transmission, not poorly planned, I shouldn't say that. This is 2022 with a lot more renewables. So it comes from an incomplete model in ways, but in a sense you could learn from that transmission is going to play a huge role in the future. And as the story goes in India, there's a big difference between monsoon and non-monsoon. That needs to be a big consideration. The other thing about looking at these models with such detail is looking at the ramps, in particular, what operators will deal with. So if you look at the left on the right on the bar chart, on the left side of the right chart is looking at the max 1 hour up ramps. And you can see that between the 160 gigawatt and the 250 scenario, the max 1 hour up ramp goes up by almost 30%. And so that's going to be a very different scenario for operators to deal with. If you look at the maximum daily valley to peak, that's only 14%. So you can see how looking at averages might not give you the whole picture for what operators and planners are going to have to deal with. So going forward to 2030, so that just gave some insights. Obviously, that's in a sense an incomplete model. But ultimately, building off of that model for 2030 is what we'll be doing with the ETC work. And David laid out a number of scenarios which we'll be building into our models to kind of look at how these options are going to work from an operational timeframe perspective. One of the real challenges is not building them, but making sure we constrain them correctly and understanding how states are going to trade, how much transmission flow is actually going to be allowed by operators, even though there might be capacity. And obviously stakeholder input is key, which is in a sense why we're all here. So thank you.
Great. So we have come to the end of the presentations. We have 20 minutes for question and answer. I think there is a microphone circulating. So if you could please raise your hands and ask your question after identifying yourself, just name and affiliation. And we'll try and take 3 or 4 questions and then take it back to the panel. And so that we get as many questions as possible, I'd ask you just to keep it brief. So who would like to ask any questions?
My name is Vishwajit. I head up Global Infosys and Asia Consulting Group. I would like to thank all the panelists for brilliant presentations, one of the best panels I've ever attended. And I've been attending panels for 30 years. What's very interesting in all of the commentary regarding system planning is that, if you look at the situation 20, 30 years ago, we were in central planning mode the world over. Then we went into IPP mode, which basically unleashed the free market forces. And now we are in a situation where we need to do very advanced system planning to ensure that promoters, and particularly incumbent players, are not destroyed at the cost of renewables. And it seems to me that in all of these components, the two big missing pieces are the policy inputs and the promoter decisions to place renewable projects and large assets. And that signal from the system design doesn't seem to be going back to the promoters, so to speak. So in other words, we are dealing with a situation where renewables is being plonked into the system, and then we are grappling with the net result using a range of tools. Whereas actually it should be policy that should be better informed, where it can be very precise about what renewable assets need to be incentivized and put into the system. So we've got a situation that is very serious and upside down, because it's going to have an impact on efficiency and cost and net cost to the end user as well.
Okay. One more question here.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Rupam Raja. I'm with Fluence Energy. We are a developer of energy storage systems. In fact, we are inaugurating a 10 megawatt 1 hour system in North Delhi day after tomorrow. The question I had is, I'm very happy to see that the temporal resolution is much better than it was when it was presented. A similar study was presented in 2017. I'm also happy that we're looking out to 2030 and not just 2022. And I think those things are very good. And I guess my question is more related to policy inputs again. We have seen, where economy-wide targets were set for solar. What we've seen is that solar picked up, prices dropped, and there was a lot of development in that space. And our experience, quite like the experience has been in California or in New York, where economy-wide targets have been set for energy storage, for example. Our experience in India with solar has been similar. And I guess my question is, the studies, what the studies are telling is fairly clear. Definitely the problem is more severe in the 2030 timeframe than it is in the 2022 timeframe. Is there a mechanism for us to move these findings over to the policymakers? And then is there a way for them to then think of setting goals that are economy-wide so that things can start to happen? That's my question.
So, one more question. There's a gentleman in the back.
Hello, my name is Ravi Prakash, and I come from academia. I represent Department of Mechanical Engineering at the National Institute of Technology at Allahabad. I have a couple of questions. One question is from the presentation. One slide which struck me was the air conditioning and electric vehicle charging requirements increasing with double-digit growth in the coming years. And can they be shifted to daytime through different technologies? For example, instead of doing window air conditioning or split the load could be shifted to district cooling schemes. That means getting chilled water or ice during the daytime and using it for the evening air conditioning loads, and also shifting charging, battery charging for electric vehicles during the daytime. And the second option, question or part of this question is on the supply side. Do you foresee concentrating solar power as eventually replacing coal-fired thermal power stations to provide base power? Because with CSP technologies, I think molten salt storage that can provide electricity during even the non-sunshine hours. So probably is it a technology of the future? I mean, when we talk about solar, we probably only focus on solar PV, but then CSP would be probably a good option.
Thank you. We'll take one more question. There was a hand raised at the table behind.
Thank you. My name is Emmanuel Guérin. I'm from the European Climate Foundation. Thank you very much to the panelists indeed for excellent presentations, and it's great to see that so much progress has been done since the launch last year, both analytically and to some extent in practice. I've got two questions. One of them is pretty fundamental, and it's a clarification question first, just to make sure that I understand the numbers included in the very first presentation. Do I understand correctly that even in the high renewable energy scenario, in 2030 you've got more coal in absolute terms than in 2008? That's the clarification question. Related to this is I wanted to hear a little bit about, in a way, what are the drivers of the composition of the energy mix in 2030, if that is based on some kind of cost optimization. We've heard a lot about the importance of taking into account the full cost of renewable energy into the system, which is indeed very important. I was wondering if there are any considerations that go into taking into considerations the full cost of coal, in particular when it comes to health through air pollution. And the second question is a bit more specific, and you've shown the relative numbers in terms of growth of basically the electrification of transport, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the absolute numbers of electric vehicles, maybe for the private fleet, or at least tell us in 2030 in your high electrification of transport scenario, what is the share of the private fleet that gets electrified? Thank you.
So we have a lot of questions. I'm going to take the liberty as MC to allocate them, but if you want to address other things, then of course, please do. So David Palchak, I thought it would be interesting for you to address the first question on system planning and how the placement of renewables and the transmission system being built around these projects could be optimized through better system planning, because this is some of the work that you can do with the kind of models that you have been discussing.
Sure, thank you for that question. I think in some cases you're right that the optimization around the growth of renewables is not completely done, and that it's been left to kind of market forces. Essentially, that's what we try to do in our model is mimic those market forces by capturing the best capacity factor sites and growing those as if investors would put their renewables there first. So that's certainly a simplification, but we think it's a pretty good one as far as the system works right now. There's certainly scenarios and studies out there that have looked at optimizing over the whole range and where renewables would maybe best balance around the country, for example, even if they're not the absolute best sites. We never did that for India. Essentially, people didn't feel like that was going to happen. So we're in our models trying to capture what we think is going to happen if it continues to be kind of private sector-led planning, in a sense, from the generation side.
And the other David, right next to David Palchak, did you want to address the question on policy for storage and how other jurisdictions have been bringing that forward, and maybe some ideas for how India could start to support the growth of storage, as well as anything else?
Yeah, and perhaps on the energy efficiency as well. If we go back to what NTPC was saying, the fallback that we have here is that if nothing else happens, the thermal generation will provide all the flexibility. What our numbers show is that storage and demand side, to the extent that we can create those, will continue to reduce the cost. But those are much less certain than what we know we can get out of the power plants. And so what we are needing to do in each of these, with storage and with demand in particular, is to develop long-term policy frameworks where we can slowly, over the next 10 to 15 years, be increasing steadily the amount and the reliability of the demand side that we have. And so if I were to go to the batteries, the case here is to begin pilots and to begin to understand how they can fit into the various different needs that we have, at the same time that we're accessing the rollout of electric vehicle penetration to get domestic manufacturing and therefore steadily reduce the cost for the stationary systems as well. So there's a clear path to be developing this. We don't know where the costs will be in 2030, but we do know that there is a lot of demand even at the current prices. And so we need a policy framework that's steadily trying to make this more competitive, as well as a framework that's enabling us to integrate. The same thing goes with the demand side question, and so I'll take the liberty of skipping to question 3 because it fits in the same mode. There are lots of different options for thinking about how we deal with the different AC charging or electric vehicles. For instance, there is one view that we should be switching a lot of the smaller vehicles to a battery swapping model rather than a charging model so that you can then charge the batteries when you want. Well, what you need to understand if that works is the costs, the additional costs of having the extra batteries that would be versus the value of flexibility they're providing. So what all this says is we need to explore different models and have the entrepreneurs that are developing it see which model works best. I am convinced that if you get the right markets and incentives in place, you will find demand-side flexibility options springing out from all sorts of places we haven't thought of. We're talking about changing the way that people use electricity, which we haven't done for 50 years. But once you give the incentives, we think that those changes will happen fast and furious. And so, yes, I'm sure they exist. But this isn't something that we need to be planning in advance. It's something that we need to be giving incentives and encouragement and maybe some programs, some government programs to begin to seed these new ideas and then see how the market evolves to take them forward.
Great. So maybe I can skip then to Mr. Ranjan to continue on the demand side management and whether we can start to...
So to continue with David's assertion that the demand side initiatives continue to be a very good big game changer in terms of flexibility option integration. Now in India and especially in Delhi, some steps have been taken by regulator. For example, TOD metering and TOD billing is there, but that is in very infancy. It's not at all having any meaningful impact, even in the C&I consumers where it is applicable. Though they have made it optional for a 3-phase essential consumer, but they are not aware. So the idea is to scratch that surface, to interact more and more with the consumers, and that's what we are trying to do with this BWE program. Once you do that, you create interest amongst them. The idea is to interact with them, convince them that demand response is a good thing for you or a DSM is a good thing for you, and then slowly you help them out how to reduce their bill while also creating flexibility out of the same system. So the trust building is the thing. So there was a good pyramid slide which Oracle shared with me earlier. So wherein with these kind of BWE programs, you interact, engage with the consumers, and then with suitable policy incentives and regulatory incentives, wherein you mainstream such kind of programs, you interact with the consumers on a regular basis. So the DR will no longer a one-time event, it will be a ongoing opt-out kind of event as it is happening. And then the technology plays a good, very big role. So that's what I believe. I mean, so interaction with the consumer and wherein the DISCOMs play a very pivotal role. So the DISCOMs have to be empowered, wherein they have to mandatorily do these kind of initiatives with specific energy efficiency targets, where the funding support or other kind of supports are also being provided, just like, say, for example, California market. Thank you.
Mr. Bhargava, the question on coal was speaking to Terry's scenarios, so obviously I wouldn't ask you to comment directly on that if you don't want to, but you could also give your perspective on how you see the future of the coal share in the generation mix, any issues raised by that question.
Yeah, thank you. Coal share will definitely come down. I mean, there's no denying that, and that's the way or that's the trajectory all of us know is going to happen. I think more the question is how long will it take to and at what percentage it will end. So 2030 could be an early scenario, but it's our sense that coal will continue to remain in the mix, not for the next 10 years, but maybe for the next 20 to 30 years. Because ultimately it's economics, so whatever will remain as the best and most economic resource in terms of providing power will be an important part. I think there was also one question about
CSP.
Yeah, CSP. So I'm no technology geek here, but by some accounts, CSP's obituary was written some time ago. More so because it lost the race against solar PV. And the way the solar PV prices came down, particularly with Chinese panels coming to the play, so CSP actually became an also-ran. I can't say will it happen in the future or not. It might, but it seems to have, that time is gone. So now the effort is more in seeing how solar PV, along with other mechanisms like battery storage and all, could actually make things happen rather than focus on CSP, because there have been very live cases where CSP led to great pain for the people who did it. So there's not much scope right now. And I'll just add to that, I think you also raised the issue of AC, and David touched upon that. I'm also involved with one of our joint venture companies, EESL, Energy Efficiency Services Limited, and they've recently introduced a technology of tri-generation. So that's heating, cooling, electricity. So that solution is already here, and all these things will happen, and using shifting AC from electricity to vapor absorption model, and all those things will actually bring in more efficiency to the systems. I think one of the points I think Vishwajit you raised, that was the question on how much renewable to do. I mean, was it that you wanted to answer? Go ask. Yeah.
I was pointing out that basically the renewable costs that are being incentivized are not the real costs. It's kind of like the nuclear equation.
Yeah.
Unless you take into account nuclear waste disposal as part of the cost. So the 2 rupees and 2 rupees 50 paise is a fake cost, because you're loading the NTPCs of the world with basically the entire load to basically ramp down and ramp up. So it's kind of like the true incentive will actually come through when you make renewables responsible for being relatively base load. In other words, they have to maintain their entire storage, and that cost of storage and release into the system has to be made to behave more like a base load plant. So in other words, the same solar plant has to have its local storage, and so when it's inducted into any system, it basically does not behave as a disruptor. It behaves as a base load, because right now the 2 rupees 40 is so deceptive, and in the public perception, green is great and everything, but actually the public doesn't realize that the true cost of that 2 rupees 40 could be 5 rupees or more.
Yeah. So thank you. I couldn't say that, so. But I totally agree, and I think that's the point I also made, that we need to actually portray the real cost of renewables, which is, optics are always good. So 244 is a great number to throw around. But yes, the fact, what you're saying is right. But that's also important from the perspective, I don't know how solar can be a base load. It might take its own course, and then the cost become. But if we, and I think it links to the question from the gentleman at the back, if we actually have to write, RIP coal at some point of time, so that needs to happen. I mean, there's no other way it can happen. So the entire thing has to ultimately come from renewable sources, whether it's solar or wind, offshore wind, or maybe anything else. I mean, we really don't know. There might be some great breakthrough, as possibly happened in mobiles, 20 years ago, then tariffs came down and all those kind of things. So if that happens, yes. So till such time, you'll have to live and bear with coal and people like, NTPC and a lot of other companies. So thank you.
So, David? Yeah, please do, and then
Can I step on this? I think you have to be very careful to not confuse cost with price or value. The cost of NTPC reacting to the load shape of renewables is not a cost to the renewables; it's a cost to the power plants themselves. Will affect the price or the value that energy has. So producing more solar on peak when you already have excess energy doesn't provide you any value unless you can put that into a battery and store it at a time. And so I think that difference is very, very important when you're looking at markets and you're looking at the options. When I hear pundits putting forward suggestions that solar should be made to be baseload, the other thing that you're missing, if you're considering it a cost rather than a price, is that it's most likely that battery will provide more value if it's placed elsewhere in the network to alleviate a transmission constraint and achieve two purposes. So if you have the value reflecting the price at every network, you're able to build the combination of solar and demand measures and storage that reduce the overall cost. And so we have to be very careful about making that differentiation and getting the incentives in market that drive it that way. Sure, there will be times when adding additional solar may not be as valuable because it's reinforcing the peak. But let's not say that that changes the cost numbers. Those cost numbers are right. It's just saying those cost numbers are at a time when they provide less value.
I agree completely, but I think the issue really is on a ground level and a policy issue level, the problems that the discoms have in basically, you know, the procurement that they are forced to do. And many in India are just simply balking. They're not buying. And because for them, the net cost of purchase from NTPC is far more cost effective. It's base load. They don't have to manage all of the other ancillary additional issues. So I think that I think the renewables sort of value to the system will be higher if we load the renewables a little bit more with curving their entire shape by adding a little bit of the responsibility of the storage locally, so to speak. You know what I mean? Instead of basically smattering the entire system with the renewables and then having the system respond to it at a system-wide level. That's far more complex.
But more efficient as well.
So if I understand your point, I mean, so we could have a hybrid renewable scenario, I mean, so, right? So I think SECI is working in that direction. I mean, Andhra Pradesh, they are trying to work on. So that might become a new norm, I think.
No one is fitting there.
Yeah.
So there were two questions on the TERI scenarios related to coal and the demand projections. Would you like me to take them?
Thomas, you can take it.
And then I could ask you to give a final word on them. Yeah. So on the coal side, in our supply side scenarios, we see growing generation from coal in any scenario, including a high RE scenario. The reason for this is that with 6% demand growth, you're adding in linear terms about 100 terawatt hours of energy demand per year between now and 2030. And meeting that just from renewables is challenging, both on how many gigawatts of capacity you need to add per year, but more importantly on grid integration of that renewable production. This does not mean necessarily that we need a commensurate increase in the number of gigawatts of coal plants, because the plant load factor of the coal fleet is quite low at the moment. So some of this increase could come from increasing the plant load factor of the coal fleet. So in our scenarios, we see the share of coal in the high renewables scenario dropping towards 50% by 2030, and thermal coal demand starting to peak around 2030 in a very aggressive renewables scenario. But yes, the absolute generation from coal increases between 2018 and 2030, even while its share is coming down in any of the scenarios. How we have come up with that, we have looked at what you could call project costs, which is the 2 rupees 50 paisa per kilowatt hour, which rightly is one metric that doesn't necessarily reflect system costs. So we have looked at system costs of our scenarios as well. We have not looked at what you could call social costs, which would be things like pollution externalities of coal-fired power plants. If the opportunity cost of land is not being reflected adequately in the project cost of renewables, then this is another social cost. But we have looked at project costs and system costs, but not at social costs at all. And our scenarios suggest that provided that you can access a diverse portfolio of flexibility, the system costs of a high renewables system can be equivalent to the system costs per unit of a system without such a high share of renewables, but only if you're doing it through a cost-effective system-wide portfolio of options. So in our high renewables scenario, we are looking at about 30% of variable renewables in generation by 2030, which is wind and solar, 35% if you include biomass and small hydro, and if one includes nuclear and large hydro, then the zero carbon share of generation is getting up towards 45%. And as I said, on a system cost perspective, our modeling suggests that you can do this cost effectively, but only if you tap a wide portfolio of flexibility options in a timely way. So that is on the coal side. Then in terms of the demand numbers, in absolute terms, air conditioning accounts for about 10% of total grid-based demand by 2030. It is a more than fourfold increase from about 50 terawatt hours today to about 250 terawatt hours with a growth rate of 10% per year. That's just air conditioning. It's not other forms of cooling such as fans and chillers. The compound annual growth rate for EVs is even faster, but its share in total demand is much lower. It's about 2%. In a really transformational EV scenario, we push penetration of EVs in new sales, just new sales, not the stock, by 2030, in the order of 40 to 50% of new sales, depending on the segment. So by segment, I mean two-wheelers, three-wheelers, private four-wheelers, commercial four-wheelers and taxi fleet, and then buses and light-duty commercial vehicles. But to give you a sense, that's what a really transformational EV scenario looks like. Our baseline is somewhat lower, more in the order of 20% to 25% of new sales by 2030. We're coming to time, so maybe we should wrap it up.
Yeah, Mr. Ramanathan having some questions, so please.
If I may, Ramanathan from Delhi. I got one observation and two questions for David Palchik. So my observation was there was a talk about demand side flexibility. It's one of the cheaper option, but what we have found in a number of studies which we have done for different states is the high uncertainty, and it depends upon, in somewhere it has not worked also because of how much a differential in pricing you have different timings, to what level of accuracy you are having your demand curves. And also in the case of industries, whatever studies we have done, what we find is certain industries, certain processes cannot be shifted, or certain workforces to which there are limitations. So although it's a good option, we have to move carefully. My question to you, David, is do you propose to carry out any stability studies? Because my doubts are because of locational issues of different sources, the location of the disturbance, and also in the case of variable renewable, what we are talking about solar or wind, the inertia issues, although synthetic inertia is being talked about, I don't think just come up in a big way. So that is one question. How are you, do you propose to carry out a study? What do you feel about it? Because any disturbance, it can disturb the power flows along the lines, it can create a disturbance. And the last question I am having is, have you considered the cross-border trading? Because some study what I have seen in India, as well as by the World Bank, although the quantum is small, there's quite a bit of complementarity in availability of power and availability of demand between the different neighboring countries, and also some of the rich renewables, what we can, on which perhaps the hydro, on the inertia benefits what we get, it has got a benefit. So do you propose to consider the cross-border benefits which can bring down the flexibility requirements what you are presently thinking? Thank you.
So David, just quick answers and then we'll...
Sure. So as far as dynamic stability, there's no plan to do that right now, although that's still an open question as far as what should be done. We've talked with POSCO and Power Grid about doing something like that in the future. We're interested. I think there is a data issue, maybe India-wide at this point, to be able to do an accurate stability study. Absolutely. Oh, yes, absolutely. I think that's an important next step, and it fits well with production cost models. We've done that before in the US, and we'd be excited to do it here as well. As far as cross-border trading, thank you for the opportunity to sell a couple studies that we did recently on Nepal and Sri Lanka. And so we have built models, and those will be part of the 2030 scenario of Nepal and Sri Lanka. I don't think we're necessarily going to look at different cross-border trading, but they will be part of the models in sort of a base scenario. And so certainly that's a consideration that we're building into the models.
I would like to thank all the participants here, and very interesting questions came about, and ultimately the vital question which came about is how do we move forward? How do we take it forward to the policymakers, and how do we get the right policy prescriptions, the right regulations, etc. That is what is the entire focus of this project. As you know, all of you know that the focus so far has been up to 2022 only, and that too the greening the grid study, and then everybody gets a comfort that only perhaps marginal curtailment of renewables is required and rest everything is very good and one can do about it. But Mr. Ramanathan brought out the issue of the stability studies, which is extremely important. We also feel it is extremely important. It needs to be studied much in detail. Greening the grid study also did not take into account any transmission restrictions. The transmission was taken more or less as a copper plate, so there is nothing on in regard to that. But 2022 is much nearer. Perhaps the questions may not become posed that big a problem. These issues may not become insurmountable sort of a thing. But now the whole entire idea of doing this project up to 2030 and taking forward is to get into the right type of questions, develop right type of perhaps recommendations, a set of recommendations, which comes out true at what point of time is a question to be answered as the time moves forward and we get to see different technologies and options maturing. So that is what it is. And I think policymakers we are engaged with the policymakers in this project as well. Ministry of Power, CERC, POSOCO, and the NTPC, and all relevant organizations are there with us, and we have had the 3 stakeholders interactions where we consulted with them. And Ministry of Power now has a committee on large scale integration of renewables, which they did a report in 2015, and based on the work which we are doing under this project, now we have been invited to that committee to link this project work to that committee's work, and that takes forward where the 2015 committee recommendations were and how do we move forward. So we are engaged with all of them, and you know the various regulations and things coming out from the CERC, etc. And they are also in the process, and we are engaged with them also, and we need to intend to take it forward very, very actively and build a debate onto the right direction so that the right questions are there and people know at least this is the suite of options, and then how quickly we should prepare for them. That is what is the most important question. I think with this, I would like to thank all of you. I would like to thank my fellow panelists for their excellent presentations, and I think you would have got something more than what you have heard so far. Thank you very much.
I just have a duty also as MC to offer a vote of thanks. First of all, to the CPI for collaborating with us a lot from the exchange, and I hope that the exchange of Terry's insights has also been useful and fruitful to you. The same goes with the policymakers, MOP, POSOCO, CEA, and the corporations that we have been exchanging with, of which you've had 2 representatives today, but they are by no means the only ones. We have Siemens, with whom we've been exchanging a lot of insights and data, and many, many others as well. So this has really been very, very fruitful, and we look forward to that interaction. And finally, to our sponsors, the board behind lists some of the philanthropic foundations that have been supporting this project, and their support has really been tremendously useful, just giving us the time and the freedom of 2 years' work to look in detail at this issue. So I won't list them all, but they're on the board behind me, and their support has really allowed us to do something that I think was urgently needed in India, but also required us taking a step back, taking the time and looking in depth at these issues. Finally, thank you to everyone who has turned up and participated today, asked such interesting and intelligent questions. Yeah, it was really good to discuss our work with you, and that it sees the light of day today and then at the launch on the 13th. So if you're around on the 13th, please do come to the plenary where these reports will be launched. Thank you very much.